Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me for Shabbat Chaverim this afternoon. I'm glad to see you back. Hope you were at services this morning and that you enjoyed them. Um, Most of you who have either walked past my office or been in my office know that I have a considerable library of books, and that is not unusual for a library, or excuse me, for a rabbi. For many of us, our libraries are among our most prized possessions. And it's funny, I can walk into a colleague's office and look at their bookshelves, and they are almost identical to mine. So, what you see in my office represents about 25% of the books that I actually have. The rest are in cartons in my garage. So, what is represented there are really the ones that I feel that I will rely on and refer to most frequently. So, and as I think some of you know who've borrowed books from me, I also consider it a kind of a lending library. So if you ever come in and you see something that looks interesting, I'm happy to loan it to you. And I do keep a list of who's got what so that I don't forget. But I want to introduce you to one of my favorites, and you may have seen me with this before in one of our classes or um, one of our discussion groups. It is called, and it is a big one, the Book of Legends. In Hebrew, Sefer HaAgadah. And as you could see from the size, this is not the kind of thing that you want to carry in a backpack every day because it is quite a large volume. That's almost 1,000 pages, and it is also large in size. I think this is a probably an 8.5 by 14, something like that. So there was a company that had put this onto a computer software program, which I had. Unfortunately, the company is no longer in business, and the discs were never, because it was at the time floppy disks, they were never updated. And so I'm unable to refer to my computer anymore for this information. I have to go to the book itself. So let me tell you what Sefer HaAgadah is. Sefer HaAgadah, and if you hear the word Agadah, you know that it sounds like Haggadah, so it's from the same Hebrew root. And loosely translated, the word means legends. Legends. And these are legends from the Talmud and the Midrash. So, what these authors have done, and I'll talk about them in a moment because they were incredible men who actually put this volume together. This was originally in the Hebrew, and when it was created as an anthology um, in English, it really brought so much of this midrash and agadah to the masses who were English speaking, who could not who could not read the Hebrew. So it was first published in Odessa in 1908 to 1911. And really was recognized immediately as a masterwork. And it was reprinted many, many times in Israel. And then the two authors who created this anthology were the Hebrew poet Chaim Nachman Bialik, and I was fortunate enough to study some of his poetry when I was last in Israel and then to go see his home, which was quite an interesting day, and the renowned author Yehoshua Chana Ravnitsky. And they were the ones who put this incredible compendium together. And it is hundreds and hundreds of texts from the Talmud and Midrashic literature. So, what is Midrashic literature? Well, as I said, Agadah, loosely translated, means legends. So a midrash is the way in which the sages, predominantly of the Talmudic era, explained various parts of the Bible, predominantly the Torah, with which they were grappling or wanted to elucidate. So that if, in a nutshell, very simply, if they came across a verse in Torah, which for them was perplexing, as we often do, they were able to find a way through story and legend and uh, a creative license to some degree of explaining what that verse meant. And there were a variety of ways that they would do this. So, for example, they would focus on a particular word or even particular letters in a particular word. And they would say that these letters indicate that the meaning of the verse is such and such. Or they would allow themselves to get into the area of gematria, which is basically Jewish numerology, where every letter of the Hebrew alphabet has a numerical equivalent. And they would find a verse in Torah that had, when they added up the numerical equivalent of the letters in that verse, they would find another verse in Torah that had the identical numerical equivalency, and they would somehow bring these two verses together and explain what they meant by showing that if this verse over here with a numerical equivalent means this, then there must be a similar meaning over here. So some of the midrash, some of the Agadah is very straightforward, and others is much more convoluted, and you really have to pick it apart. So this particular compendium, as large as it is, reflects the theological concerns of the rabbinic sages, the role of Israel and the nations, the role of God, good and evil, human relations, the world of nature, and even the art of healing. And so it is kind of like in everything you always wanted to know but were afraid to ask. And I have turned to this volume so many times um, because it really gives you great insight into the working of the minds of the rabbis. Sometimes how devious they were in figuring something out, how intellectual they were, how smart they were, how knowledgeable they were. And so this particular book really focuses on the Agadic texts. Now, what are the Agadic texts? Those are the texts that are more, when we say the word Haggadah, what is the Haggadah? It's the story that we tell at Pesach by reading through the Haggadah, correct? It's an Agadah story. So they're looking at parables and proverbs and all kinds of things. So this will become more clear as I bring you some of these selections from this particular book. One of the other reasons it's one of my favorites is because it was a gift from my mother and father. And so it has special meaning to me. I actually received it from them in May of 1996. That was 9 years before I became a rabbi. And I had just completed a master teachers program through the Community Foundation, the Chicago Foundation for Jewish Education. It was a year-long program, and it was a gift from them at that time. And They wrote in the book, in the inscription, that Martin Buber, the great Jewish philosopher, wrote, "To one who knows how to read the legend, it conveys more truth than the chronicle." So I don't know how they found that verse, but it's really perfect. That sometimes when you can read and understand the legend, you learn more from that than actually reading the literal account of something. And because reading the legend gives it a human, it's infused with a more human element. So let me show you how this massive volume is set up. There are a variety of ways that you can find content. And the first is, and just to give you some insight, there's a huge index or a huge content area, and then an even larger index in the back. So first, what we get is a journey through the Bible, and they start with creation, and they work their way all the way through parables, proverbs, and sayings. So, if you are looking for something that comes from the Torah itself, you can find untold numbers of midrash, untold numbers of stories and legends in here that would allow you to explain even a specific word or verse from the Torah. And the beauty of this volume, the beauty of this compendium of midrashic literature, is that anyone can read this. That you do not have to be a scholar of Jewish wit and wisdom. Much of this is understandable to scholars and laypersons alike. So, for example, if I wanted to read something specific about the Garden of Eden, I would be able to go to this first section under the work of creation, and I would be able to look up, for example, heaven and earth, the light, the water, grasses and trees, the moon, the variety of creatures, man, the handiwork of the Holy One, and so on. And each of these is a large section. This goes all the way through the deeds of the fathers, and by the fathers here they mean our patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all the way through Joseph and Pharaoh, then into Israel and their departure from Egypt, being in Israel and the wilderness. Then they get into judges, kings, and prophets. So we are working our way through the entire Hebrew Bible, but looking at just the legends associated to the different parts of the Bible. Then we get into the sages and just about any topic that you have an interest in. So I'm going to turn now from the front of the book, which is this index, to the back of the book, because that's where the fun starts. And I'm going to show you how one finds what they're looking for. First of all, there's a glossary, so that if there's a word that you don't understand, you can look it up. And their definition of midrash is exposition or exegesis of Scripture. So exegesis is pulling out the meaning of a piece of Scripture, as opposed to eisegesis, which is putting one's own definition into a part of Scripture. So we are drawing out and elaborating on a piece of scripture. So here they also have a whole index of the different sages, when they lived and who they were. And then we get into an index of names of various characters, mostly the sages, the rabbis, personal names. Sometimes you hear of a rabbi referred to as somebody ben, and then other times you hear of a rabbi as somebody bar. So you know the word bar mitzvah. Well, if the word ben means son of, why is it a bar mitzvah? You may have wondered that. Well, ben is Hebrew and bar is Aramaic. So depending upon which sage is writing what, we may either have Aramaic exposition. Remember, this book was originally not in English. Or we may have exposition of a passage in Aramaic, maybe in Hebrew. What then follows is an A through Z listing of words, and you can literally look up any word that you want to find something that may be in the Torah or in the entire Hebrew Bible. So, for example, we spoke this morning about the Torah portion, Chukat. Chukat means laws, and Laws. And there's a whole discussion in the beginning of the Torah portion about the red heifer, this red-colored or orange-colored calf that is going to be born, that is going to herald the coming of the Messiah. And it is treated until it's slaughtered and burned up on the altar. It's treated with great reverence, so much so that Eleazar, one of the high priests, has to take it outside the camp and slaughter it, and then he has to stay outside of the camp until he's clean again. And it's a whole mishaberach, as they say. So if I wanted to find something about the red heifer, I would simply go to the word red, and I would look up red heifer. And I'm doing this, I haven't looked. I hope I'm going to find something here. And here is the red heifer, and it refers me to the page number and to the item number under the page. And for the red heifer here, there are 3 different citations, and I'm just going to pick one of them and see what we come up with. So I'm going to go back to page 234, entry 156. You can see why you have to have upper body strength to get through this volume. 234. And by the way, I'm doing all of this because I'm going to get to something in a moment that I specifically want to read to you. So if we go back to page 234, you could see why this was easier when it was on the computer, right? You could just put in numbers and go right to that page without having to flip back and forth. So 234, page 234, reference 156. And here is what it says. Some time ago, a legal decision about the ash of the red heifer. So, in other words, when you make a korban, which is a sacrifice that is burned up, as opposed to just slaughtered and laid on the altar. Some time ago, a legal decision about the ash of the red heifer was put to 38 elders in a vineyard in Yavna. Now, you know where Yavna is. Yavna is where the ancient sages had one of their schools where they studied, who declared its flesh ritually unclean. The issue was one of the matters of Rabbi Yossi the Galilean, debated with Rabbi Akiva. So we're getting some exposition and explanation about what happens to the ashes of the red heifer once it is burned up. Rabbi Akiva disposed of Rabbi Yosei, who subsequently found a rejoinder and asked Rabbi Akiva, "May I go back to the subject?" And Rabbi Akiva said, "No other man but you may, because you are Yosei the Galilean." So Yosei must have been, quite a scholar for Rabbi Akiva to allow him, once the discussion had ended, to bring it up again. Then Rabbi Yosei set forth the rejoinder he had thought of. So it would be like being in a classroom and having a discussion. And mind you, this says that that the legal decision was put to 38 different elders in a vineyard. Maybe they were drinking a little bit, and so Rabbi Yossi has this conversation and this discussion with Rabbi Akiva, and then they go on to something else. And then Rabbi Yossi says, I think I might have forgotten something. Rabbi Akiva, would you mind going back to that? Is it okay with you if we bring that subject up again? And Rabbi Akiva says, well, normally I wouldn't do this, but you are Reb Yossi from Galilee. And so, of course, I'm going to show you the reverence due to you. And so we're not going to get a discussion about the ashes of the red heifer. Now we're going to get a discussion of what it was that Rabbi Akiva did to honor Rabbi Yossi. And recalling this incident, Rabbi Tarfon, another rabbi, quoted, "I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, and none of all the beasts could stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and grew great." The ram is Rabbi Akiva, according to Rabbi Tarfon. So what does all this mean? It's very cryptic language, and most of us would read this and we go, huh? What does this mean? And what it means is that, Rabbi Akiva was kind of the final word. And when he was ready to move on in a discussion, the discussion was over. But the fact that he was kind enough or gratuitous enough to allow, gracious enough, that's the word I'm looking for, to allow Rabbi Yosei to bring the subject up again and not say, we're done with that, we've moved on, that he gave him the kavod, the honor of bringing this up again. And Rabbi Tarfon likened Rabbi Akiva to a ram who, is able to push in all directions without anybody able to stand up against them. But because of his ability to also see other human beings and allow them an opportunity, this is Rabbi Akiva, he grew great. Now, that verse is not something that Rabbi Tarfon made up himself. That verse that says, "But he did according to his will and grew great," comes from the book of Daniel. And this was something that the rabbis were brilliant at doing. They would find a verse from, they knew the Bible. They knew the entire Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, by heart. They didn't have to go and look it up. And so Rabbi Tarfon was able to pull a verse from the book of Daniel in order to explain this incident between Rabbi Yosei and Rabbi Akiva. And part of it was homiletical, that they could give a sermon or find a verse while standing on one leg, so to speak. But part of it was also hyperbole, because the rabbis loved to show off. They loved to show their brilliance. And in fact, many of these midrashic components that we find have very convoluted thinking. So we'll start with one verse from Torah, and they will take us through this very elaborate explanation of something. And in doing so, bring us verses from all over the Tanakh. So they'll start with something in the Torah, and then they'll go to something in prophets, then come back to something in the book of 1 Samuel, then go to something in Psalms, and then eventually bring us back to the verse in Torah that they were trying to explain in the first place. So the brilliance of these men, and yes, they were men, is pretty remarkable. Let me see if there's something else about the red heifer in here. 459 and 60, 533. Okay. 459 and 60. You'll have to give me a second to find the page. Again, we've got a 1,000-page book here. So I'm using these examples of the red heifer because that is in our current Torah portion. And how might I use something like this? Well, I may use it in a sermon. I may use it specifically one midrash in a class to really delve into it. But now we're going to come upon a completely different midrash about the red heifer. And here's how it goes, and I'll kind of interject some things as we go. A heathen. What is a heathen? A heathen is a non-believer. So a heathen said to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, "The things you Jews do appear to be a kind of sorcery. A heifer is brought, is burned up, and is pounded into ashes, and its ashes are gathered up. Then, when one of you gets defiled by contact with a corpse, 2 or 3 drops of water mixed with these ashes are sprinkled upon him, and he is told, 'You are now cleaned.' And this is indeed what was done with the ashes of the red heifer. They were seen as a method of purification, so that if somebody became impure as a result of coming in contact with a corpse, they could have this mixture of these ashes and some water sprinkled on them, and they would now be cleansed. So this heathen, this non-Jew, this non-believer, comes to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, ostensibly to mock him and to say, you Jews have these strange customs, but the fact that he says it's some kind of sorcery is critical here, because the Jewish scripture tells us that sorcery is not permitted in Judaism. And so this heathen knows enough about Jewish custom to know that sorcery is forbidden. And he is confronting Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai with this. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai asks the heathen, "Has the spirit of madness ever possessed you?" So he kind of changes the subject, but he's getting there. "Has the spirit of madness ever possessed you?" And the heathen replies, "No." And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai comes back and says, have you ever seen anyone possessed by the spirit of madness? And the heathen replies, yes. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai presses him a little bit further and says, and have you seen what you people do to that man? Meaning, you non-Jews? Roots are brought, they are made to smoke under him, and water is splashed on him until the spirit flees. So this is how the heathen answers. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai knows exactly how to refute what this man is saying. He comes to him and says, you kill this red calf, you burn it up, you take the ashes, and whenever somebody is defiled by a corpse, you take the ashes, you mix it with a little water, and you sprinkle it on the person, and they're cleansed. He's making a mockery of what he considers to be sorcery, this heathen is. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, wait a minute, buddy. You guys do something really similar. When somebody is possessed, you bring certain roots from certain plants. You make them into smoke under him, which means you burn them up into ashes, and then you splash water until this evil spirit that is possessing this individual flees. And then Rabbi Yochanan says to him, do not your ears hear what your mouth is saying? A man defiled is like a man possessed by a spirit. So now Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is attempting to use the process by which the red heifer is used to say that when a person is defiled by a corpse, it's like being possessed by an evil spirit. So he says, are your ears not listening to what your mouth is saying? A man defiled is like a man possessed by a spirit. This spirit is a spirit of uncleanness. And when water of lustration is splashed on it, it flees. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is saying, we're not so different after all. The mixture that we splash on someone is to get the evil spirit of uncleanliness to disappear. You use roots and things that are burned up and mix them with water and splash them on someone to get the evil spirit to go. So after the heathen left, Rabbi Yochanan's disciples said, our master, you thrust off that heathen with a mere reed of an answer. But what reply will you give us? So what is a reed? Think about a reed. A reed is a long, narrow plant, right? It is somewhat fragile looking. It bends. It could break easily. And so what Rabbi Yochanan's disciples who've been listening to this exchange say to him is, you kind of brushed him off with a very simplistic answer. You gave him a comparison, but it wasn't a very erudite, very scholarly, very deep answer. But we're your disciples, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, so we can deal with something a little bit more deep. So try us out. And Rabbi Yochanan answered, as you live, the corpse does not defile, nor does the mixture of ashes and water cleanse. So now Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is kind of changing his mind here. He's saying, there's nothing inherently about a corpse that defiles a human being. And frankly, there's nothing about these waters of lustration, as they were called, the waters with the ashes mixed in, that cleanses. The truth is that the rite of the red heifer is a decree of the King who is King of Kings. The Holy One said, I have set down a statute. I have issued a decree. You are not permitted to transgress my decree. This is a statute of the Torah. So this is where we get the word chukat, which is a statute or a law. And in fact, that verse, this is a statute of the Torah, is from Numbers 19, verse 2, chapter 19, verse 2, which I chanted this morning in services. So now this is how we get back to our specific verse from the Torah. And Rabbi Yochanan, given that he is a magnificent Torah scholar, brings this verse out to prove to his students that, it's not the red calf, it's not the ashes, it's not the water, it's not a corpse, it's none of those things. What is it? It's because God said so. And because it's a statute and a law, and you're not allowed to transgress that. So it needs no further explanation. The reason he gave the explanation to the heathen about a person being possessed is so that he could show that what Jews did was not sorcery. It was no different from what the heathens did when somebody was possessed by an evil spirit. But to his students, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, look, guys, it's not really the water. It's not the calf. It's not the ashes. And it's not the corpse. It's because God said it. And because we're not supposed to transgress a law, a chukat, a chok, that God has set down. Why are male animals specified for all communal sacrifices, whereas a female is specified for the rite of the red heifer? So I didn't know this until I was preparing that the red heifer was a female. And I don't recall it saying that in the Torah portion, that it was a female. We didn't get the word zachar or nekeva unless I missed it somehow. And so you had to use a female red heifer, which made it even more rare, because not only did it have to be completely red in color, but a para aduma, a red heifer from the word adom, aduma, but it had to be bli mum. It had to have no boo-boos, no cuts, no pimples, no sores, nothing on it to be considered the perfect red heifer, and it had to be a female. So, we're getting pretty specific here. So the question arises, why are male animals sacrificed for all the other communal sacrifices? So if one were to bring a sacrifice for well-being, or a sin sacrifice, or a different kind of a sacrifice that they brought to the temple for the priest to sacrifice on their behalf, any of those could be male animals. Why did this have to be a female animal? And so Rabbi Ibu, another rabbi, said, consider this parable. Now, parables are a very, very common homiletical device in Midrash, that a rabbi would give a parable, a story, an explanation as a way to answer a question. So Rabbi Ibu said, there was a maidservant's child who polluted the king's palace. So, who is the maidservant? Well, we could take that literally and say it was a woman who worked in the king's palace, But who is the king? And in the parables in Midrash, the king is always God. So the maidservant was a human being, and we're using this parable to describe why it has to be a female red heifer. What does it mean that the child polluted the king's palace? Well, we can only take a guess that the child probably did something in the palace to dirty it. And what does a child do? They probably relieved themselves somehow in the king's palace. And the king said, "Let his mother come and wipe up this mess." In the same way, the Holy One said, "Let the mother of a calf come and atone for the misdeed of the calf." Now, we may still think that we're talking about the red heifer here, and indeed, we kind of are. However, what is the misdeed that they are talking about? Not that this little child defiled the king's palace, but the misdeed of the golden calf. So the rabbis in their midrash are constantly tying their current explanations back to something else which may have occurred somewhere else in the Bible, which is just an incredibly interesting way that they can tie it all together. Why would they want to tie it all together? Because they are trying to make the scripture come alive for the people in their day and age. And by telling these stories and using these explanations, that's how they do it. So somebody came and asked the question, why does it have to be a female? Well, if a person is defiled, it's like a little kid who defiles the palace of the king. You bring in the mother to clean it up. So the mother is a female. And this goes back all the way to the sin of the golden calf. When Moses was on Mount Sinai and getting the Ten Commandments and the Torah, and of course the people became restless and they became stubborn and they didn't want to wait any longer and they claimed he wasn't coming back. And so they harassed Aaron until he finally was able or finally was convinced to help them build this golden calf, because he thought if he didn't succumb to their requests, they were going to kill him and then they would be left leaderless until Moses got back. So the rabbis are pulling and picking and drawing and uncovering various parts of the entire Bible, bringing them together to prove a point. And this is drawing a proof text from this particular part of the Torah in order to prove why it was a female cow that had to be used, why it was a female red heifer, in order to cleanse somebody of the uncleanliness that they got from touching a corpse. Okay, so as I mentioned this morning, this is actually a double portion this Shabbat. And Hukat, which is what I read from this morning, has the story of the red heifer. Also, a very brief description of the fact that Miriam died and was buried there, which is in the land of Tzin, where the Israelites were encamped at the time. So they buried her and they left her there. And it was very unceremonial because we don't get any description that she was mourned, or that that the community had any kind of memorial towards her, as they did for Moses, as they did for Joseph, as they did for Jacob. So Miriam unfortunately gets very short shrift. However, the very next verse in the Torah portion is that after Miriam dies, that the water source disappears. And from that, we are to make the connection that Miriam was somehow linked to the source of water. Okay. The next Torah portion, Balak, is very interesting. Balak was a Moabite king. And the Israelites were encamped in the valley. And he has a prophet, a sorcerer by the name of Bilam. And Balak, the king, asked Bilam to go to the top of the hill, look down over the Israelites, and curse them. Bilam does not want to do it because he knows that the Israelite king, the king of the Israelites, the God of the Israelites, is a powerful God, and he's afraid. Finally, he is convinced by the king. I guess you pay someone enough money, they'll do anything, right? He's convinced by the king to go. But Bilam says to Balak, the king, I may not have any control of what comes out of my mouth. So I'm going to go and I'll do your bidding. But, their God is a pretty strong God. I don't know what's going to happen when I speak. So, long story short, Bilam ventures out on a donkey. He's on the road to overlook the Israelites and to curse them. There they are down in the valley. Balak, the king of Moab, has already said, I don't want them camping in my backyard. And so Bilam is on this donkey and he is on the road. And all of a sudden, the donkey sees in the middle of the road a figure, an angel, a malach, a messenger, who is in the middle of the road with a sword on fire, and this turning sword. And the donkey pulls back and stops immediately. Very abrupt stop. And Bilam takes his whip and whips the donkey and says, "What's wrong with you?" Because he does not see it. And they continue on their way. And it happens a second time where the donkey sees this figure in the middle of the road and becomes petrified and rears back and stops abruptly. And again, Balaam hits the donkey and, chastises it and says, "What are you doing?" And they go off again. And it happens a third time, but this time the donkey veers off the road, falls down, and throws Bilam off his back. And now Bilam, this prophet, is very, very upset and speaks to the donkey and says, "What are you doing? Why are you doing this?" And a miracle occurs. The donkey opens its mouth and speaks to Bilam and says, "Don't you see that figure in the middle of the road there with the flaming sword that's turning around? This is a warning to us that we should not go and do what Balak, the king, is telling us to do." And so but Bilam is at that point committed. He has to do this. And he goes to the top of the mountain and he overlooks the Israelites in the valley below. And he utters these words: "Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, mishkenotecha Yisrael." How beautiful are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. So and then continues with the blessing. So instead of being able to curse the Israelites, the words that come out of his mouth are instead a blessing. So there are a number of midrashim about this narrative. And what's very interesting about the story of Balak, the king, Ben Peor, son of Peor, this Moabite king, is that there have been some other ancient texts that have been very similar to this story that predate the text from the Torah. And this is one of those narratives that just seems to be stuck in there. It's kind of like the story of the Tower of Babel. We're going along, and then all of a sudden we have this strange story that isn't connected to what came before or what comes after. And similarly, this account of the story of the king Balak and his prophet Bilam is very much like that. So there are scholars who believe that this was a story that came from another culture and was co-opted and lifted and put into our own Torah text, and then tweaked a little bit to give it to make it more conducive to the Israelite or Jewish perspective. So there is a wonderful midrash that actually comes from Pirkei Avot. And it says that, and we studied Pirkei Avot before Shavuot, and it says that there were 10 things created Ben Shmot in the dusky time, the dusk part of the day, Ben Hashmashot. So God created for 6 days, and then there was this kind of magical, ethereal, mystical time during the dusk, the twilight, the evening between the 6th day and the 7th day. And the Midrash says that God created 10 things at that particular time that we don't hear about in the description of creation, but that we hear about coming later on. And I want to find that midrash for you and read it to you because I think you'll find it very interesting. And it is connected to our Torah portion, Balak, from today. So what I'm going to do now is turn to Pirkei Avot, which has a reference to this talking donkey. And it says the following: 10 things were created on the eve of the first Shabbat at twilight. So when was the first Shabbat? Well, it was the evening of the 6th day of creation. And what the rabbis are saying is that during that evening, Erev Shabbat, God created 10 things at that very mystical time of twilight. And these are they: the mouth of the earth for the swallowing of Korach in his assembly. And we talked last week about Korach, the priest who confronted Moses and Aaron and said, you guys shouldn't be the only ones to have this special relationship with God. After all, aren't we all a holy nation? And Korach and all of his followers got kind of a shock when the earth opened up and swallowed them. So that opening earth was one of these 10 things that God created on Erev Shabbat. The mouth of the well, which was the boulder that Moses struck. Remember, Moses struck the boulder to get, or the big rock to get water out of it. And water doesn't usually just come flowing out of a rock. I suppose you could figure out if there was somehow there was water behind it or flowing from somewhere. That was the second thing. And the mouth of the donkey of Bilam. And the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey. So important was this talking donkey in the narrative to warn the prophet Bilam that there was this man with a sword, this vision of an angel with a sword, warning them about what would happen when they tried to curse the Israelites. And Bilam didn't see it, but the donkey saw it. And, this also gives us some insight into how animals were looked at, that perhaps animals are more sensitive and have greater insight than human beings, because clearly this donkey saw something that Bilam did not see. So that was the third thing that was created in this twilight, in this Erev Shabbat. And the rainbow. My rainbow have I given in the cloud. So which rainbow? Well, the rainbow that marked the sign between God and humanity, that God would never attempt to destroy human beings again. And the manna in the wilderness. The manna in the wilderness. So none of these things are described in Genesis when we have the description of creation. These are all things that come up later. The manna in the wilderness, and the staff of Moshe with which he did the signs. So Moses had this magic staff that he was able to do the various miracles in Egypt. And the shamir. A shamir was a type of long worm, and King Solomon built the temple with it, as he would place it on the stone and it would split these great big stones, and no hammer or axe or any iron tool was heard in the house while it was being built. So the entire temple was built without using any kind of implement. And the letters, the Torah that was written in front of God from the 6 days of creation, with black fire on top of white fire. And the writing, the forming of the letters on the tablets, and the tablets themselves. So, and then finally, the ram of Abraham our father, the ram that gets caught in the thicket by its horns. So the rabbis saw that there were these things that were appearing in the Torah that had not been described in creation. It doesn't say on the fourth day God created rainbows and talking donkeys, or earth that opens up and swallows people. So how did they determine when these things were created? They said, well, on Erev Shabbat, that first Erev Shabbat, while everybody was sleeping and getting ready for the seventh day of rest, that's when God was creating these other special items. So in that way, it's related to our Torah portion from this morning, Balak. And by the way, Balak is one of the few Torah portions, there are about 8 or 9 of them, that are named for people, and one of only 2 that's named for somebody who is not an Israelite. Balak and Yitro. Yitro, who was Moses' father-in-law. So, Sefer HaAgadah, the Book of Legends. It is such a marvelous tool. And if you ever read anything, a verse from Torah, something that you come across while you are reading anything or discussing something, and you have a question about maybe its roots or what the rabbis had to say about it, come find me and we can look it up and see, because I guarantee you 9 out of 10 times the rabbis had something to say about everything. They were never lost for words, and they loved to expound, they loved to drash, and they loved to explain things through legend, through parables, and through using bits and pieces of the Hebrew Bible to explain their position. So I'll wish you Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you again on Tuesday morning For Chai There with Rabbi Leah. Enjoy the rest of your Shabbat. Lehitraot. Bye bye.